Muy buenas tardes. Welcome to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes, Leeds and Manchester. I'm Pedro Eusebio, the director of those cultural centers in Northern England. Today, first of all, welcome to all of you, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guests, Dr. Kathryn Kendrick and Professor Rosi. Thank you for joining us in this third event of the series Ex Libris, Publications in Hispanic Studies, in collaboration with Professor Rosi, who is the professor and deputy head of School of Modern Languages and Culture at Durham University. As you might know, because we have quite a few people that are following this series after now 2 years, in this series, we try to bring some of the most prominent publications about the Hispanic culture as a whole, with different subjects and matters in a wide variety of subjects. As I said, gastronomy. Today, we are going to speak about education and the historic approach to the Hispanic education at the beginning of the 20th century. Literature, of course. So that is what makes to my feeling is the special of this series. Is not just one subject, that the different approaches about the Hispanic culture as a whole. I would like also to introduce the host, Professor Rosi, who has published many works on contemporary Spanish culture, film, and literature, and some of her publications include Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain. As a co-author, Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating. Also, Trace of Contamination, Unearthing the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse, and Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida as co-editor as well. Her articles have been published in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, MLM, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among many others. And then we have the special guest today, Dr. Kathryn Kendrick, who is a clinical associate professor of literature and director of global awards on the New University in Shanghai. Dr. Kendrick's research brings together Spanish literature and intellectual thought with the history of education and child studies. Her work has been published in the Modern Language Review, the Bulletin of Spanish Studies, and Global Studies of Childhood. And currently, she's co-editing, a special issue of the Bulletin of Hispanic Studies on Education and Global Hispanophone. Her PhD was awarded from the Association of Hispanics of Great Britain and Ireland Prize for the Best Doctoral Thesis of 2015, with the resulting book which we are going to launch today in Instituto Cervantes, Humanizing Childhood in the Early 20th Century. It received also the MLA's 2021 award, Kathryn Singer Kovacs Prize for the outstanding work in Spanish and Latin American Studies. Dr. Kendrick is a member of the Association of Hispanics of Great Britain and Ireland, the Association of the Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies, the Modern Language Association, and the National Association of Fellowship Advisors. She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she was Gates Cambridge Scholar, as well as a Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University. Well, today the discussions will be focused on this excellent book, Humanizing Childhood in Early 20th Century Spain, which has been published in 2020 by Legenda. And this book, as I have already mentioned, has received quite many awards. Like, for example, Kathryn Singer Kovacs Prize and Modern Languages Association, as I mentioned, for the best book in the field of Latin American Spanish literature cultures. and the first book award International Standing Conference for History of Education for innovative and exemplary scholarship in the field of history of education. So the book will be analyzed with the help of our coordinator Rosi, but very briefly, it's very special because it analyzed the reality of the education in the beginning of the 20th century, when there were so many avant-garde movements, not only in Spain, but in the whole Europe, whole world. And that has a very direct influence about the ideas, about the education, how the methodology should evolve in according to the new ideas, the new approaches. And this created a special atmosphere because some people who participated in the process are like the philosophers Miguel de Unamuno, José Ortega y Gasset, or Carmen Conde. So very, very interesting, excellent book. I recommend you very, very strongly to read it if you have not done so yet. And without further ado, I give the floor to Rosi. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Pedro Eusebio, for your warm welcome. Thank you, Ana, for joining us. I'm so glad to be able to host you for this series. We were wondering if we were going to have to wake you up in the middle of the night to do this. I'm very glad that we didn't have to get to that point. Again, congratulations on this fascinating and really amazing work that you have done on childhood and education in 20th century Spain. So before we go into sort of talking about some of the major themes of this book, and it's so rich. I don't know if I'm going to be just doing justice to this, but I just wanted to start saying how much I enjoyed reading it, how much I learned actually reading this book. So I, again, recommend everyone to take a look during your summer break. So can you start us, Ana, with the idea of children as enigma, because that's sort of the beginning of your book when you go into that the table of contents, right? So it's an interesting word, right? So why an enigma, or perhaps in what sense an enigma, right? And why for you as an author, right? It's an interesting enigma as well.
Yeah, I also was struck by that term, which is, of course, why it appears so prominently. And thank you so much, Rosi, for the invitation and for your kind words coming in. It's wonderful to be here and to see various familiar faces and new ones as well. So to speak to the enigma, I think it was a term that I was coming across actually in otherwise, what one might think is quite dry pedagogical literature, or pedagogical is a term I'll bring in, so the study of the child. This idea that, well, there's all these things that we know that we are researching and learning, but so much of the experience of being a child, of childhood phenomenology, of the way that they look at the world, what they bring in, what they think and experience is unknowable. And so I was seeing that on the one hand in these works of child studies thought from the 19-teens and onward, or earlier even. But then I was also finding it in, for instance, the work of Carmen Conde. Actually, I don't think she uses the term enigma perhaps, but it's what I start out with thinking about the enigma. She asks in her book Jubilos, which is a collaboration with Nora Borges and Gabriel Mistral, who introduces it, various short poems and images that evoke teaching and children and memories of childhood and of the classroom. And she asks something like, who are these shining stars, this cascade of stars that are children? Where do they come from? What do they do? What do they think? And so that wonderment, I think, is something that struck me, and which is coexisting at the same time as really rich discussions on the crisis in the sciences and the physical sciences and specialization and what we know and what we can't know. So as this scientific lens also on childhood measurement and development and growth, that there's kind of a simultaneous backlash is what I was seeing or reading against what seems like a reductionist way of viewing childhood and education and growth. So what is that other side? Is it something ineffable, the spirits or the enigma, perhaps? So it's a very multivalent term, and I think it could be used in various different ways, but that's one way that I sort of started to approach it and think there is some sort of central enigma that in different ways, so many different figures across society are trying to address.
Yes, and it's actually a very good starting point, right? Because I think, as you said, you bring so many technical sort of measure, almost like images and charts, yet your reading of the topic is very poetic as well, right? So I think the weaving of the science and sort of the poetic nature of what children are, or we understand them to be, right? It's really very weaved in a very engaging way. And also, reading that first introduction as well, right? When Gabriela Mistral makes an appearance, suddenly you're struck by thinking, oh yes, Mistral is a poet, but also she was a teacher, right?
Also,
her presence there was very significant. So can we contextualize that question then? So why do you think childhood is considered or is important for or in Spain in this period? So the way you approach it, why is this important to take into account in the precise moment of Spanish history and culture?
So, I mean, it's important for a lot of reasons, and I came to it organically just by seeing its presence, I think, as one does in reading and something to notice. And we could ask the same thing about childhood, I think, at many different periods where it takes on certain aspects of significance, and certainly has its symbolic qualities in wartime and in other contexts, or the romantic child of earlier periods, or today there's this surging, I think, for several years, interest in the figure of the child in childhood, and certainly post-pandemic as well. We could have other, different conversations about how we think of futurity through children and through next generations. But I guess what I was seeing and interested in thinking about the role of childhood was, why are so many intellectuals at that time focused on it? And so I think I first came across these very essays on pedagogy in collected essays of Ortega y Gasset, or Biología y Pedagogía, and the term just kept returning, and that was not what I set out to study. So I was just seeing it again and again, and thinking, so this question of education, I mean, that's not a surprise for anyone who studied the early 20th century in Spain. The Krausist influence, the Instituto Libre de Enseñanza, all of those are having a very direct impact, and are very much worked into the ways in which one thinks about national regeneration and the politics of it. But I felt that there was also something else that was more, as you say, poetic, and a kind of richer undercurrent of thought and study. And so I think it wasn't really until much further into the project, or even turning the thesis into a book in some way, that idea that actually this is an aesthetic of childhood. This is a kind of avant-garde impulse. I mean, it came through as when you look at the works of Lorca or Guillen or many other figures who are using the lightness or the freshness, the movement, the joy of that one sees in the cover of my book is Children on a Beach. By Sorolla, which is a slightly earlier example of a work than what I actually really spent most of the time on, but I think it speaks to exactly that aesthetic that they're capturing in many ways. So why it's important, I think you could see it from the political, you could see it from the literary aesthetic, and then where I get to or argue is that it also, you see in debates on childhood a growing polarization as well. I argue for a central belief in an aspect of holism that is the ideal of how children are raised to be individuals and humans, but that how that actually happens, of course, is hits at some of the fault lines that that Hispanists would be looking at in studying that period.
Yeah, and I actually approached the book thinking that it was going to be very political. And actually, in fact, it's not political. I mean, the politics is very important, of course, but it really does capture sort of that cultural moment. You talk about Gestalt, for example, right? Sort of that entorno in the context and how one actually reacts and communicates with that context and in that formative year. And I was very surprised to see all of these names that make an appearance, right, in your book. But before we get to them, let's go back to a person that actually looms very large in your book. And it was actually, again, surprising for me because I know of his work perhaps through other essays and so on. So Ortega y Gasset, you just encountered him all the time in this book. So can you expand perhaps in what ways his writing or his thinking or even his initiatives, right, were connected to children's education during this time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned biología y pedagogía. He also speaks of the anachronism of pedagogy, and in one essay, this idea that we're always behind, no matter whatever efforts we as educators or thinkers come up with, we're always going to be one step behind where the world is, where it's gotten to. And so it's inherently anachronistic. And I found that a really interesting idea. So it also gets at the idea that we're always, even today should be shaping education for adapting times and movements. So, but Ortega occupies this kind of place in the firmament in a sense that so he's writing about everything, he's translating and bringing in figures from Freud onward. But I was interested in, and this is something that Alison Sinclair and I spoke about back at the time, that in some ways, I think the what comes through Ortega is not always it's not a marker of this is necessarily important. You bringing in, there's so much that's coming in. But what I noticed in particular was an openness and interest to what were called the new sciences, the new post-crisis science, so post-World War I. And that included, as you said, Gestalt, the Gestalt psychology from Germany. So that essentially thinks about and looks at how viewing the world as a whole, as a global entity, so that we start from this larger perception and only then zoom into the details. So I follow that idea through works of pedagogy and children's literature in Spain, through the pedagogues who are actually reading works of Gestalt psychology, and Kafka is a big name there, who appears many times in works of pedagoggy of child studies in Spain, written, for instance, by Domingo Bernes, later Minister of Education. So because I also had a particular interest in comparative Spanish-German work when I was starting out in my master's and PhD, still do, but that was one of the guiding forces. So I was also looking at and interested in these importations and what's happening with those ideas. And so another one of these new sciences was coming from a figure named von Uexküll, who's writing about sort of the new biology, which is perceptual as well. So the way that we see the world is not stable or fixed, or is every single individual organism. So the way that an ant or a bat experiences and views the world is modulated by their structure, by the way that they are formed, how they are in the world. And by that argument, the child is also going to have a completely different world than the adult. So this idea of the world of the child, the mundo del niño, becomes a very pervasive term. And it's used by Dewey in the US and is translated into Spanish. So it's not a purely direct line from Uexküll, from the biology, from German. But these ideas of like temporality and how does the child experience the world as like a stable, progression of time or stops and starts, and kind of you remember certain things, right? You remember childhood in different ways. And so it gets mixed up with discussions of memory and experience in a very, again, perceptual and phenomenological way that I found a really important aspect and counterpart to some of the more physical and quantitative discussions. So I don't know, Unamuno, is another big name from the period, and he's always writing about the quantitative and the qualitative, and how we, how one, what should be preference, and where does that start from?
Yeah. And I was actually surprised at sort of these discussions about thinking how children learn, sort of recognizing patterns rather than details, and how would actually one teach about, and what's the measurement of intelligence, right? Intelligence is not about being, to be able to sort of, what was it, like answer a question, but rather sort of solve a situation. And in order to solve a situation, you need to understand what is going on structurally. So I thought that discussion
the whole
was,
context.
Yeah, exactly. And in that sense, not only about how children learn and how children connect with sort of, or understand their context, is about sort of establishing a relationship with the outside world as well. And I think that that's when it quickly gets connected perhaps with the idea of art, and precisely in your discussion is the avant-garde, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how, and you actually said that this point didn't become more clear until you actually wrote this book. But I think that you make a really brilliant argument about how actually thinking about how children connect with the world, or how they produce even their own little poetry or drawings, actually is connected to the way that artists are thinking about art, about producing art, or art's place in society, right? And actually just thinking a little bit, I know it has nothing to do with it, but just to play in the words, right? That you were thinking about Ortega and Gasset and la deshumanización del arte, right? So you're thinking about dehumanizing the art, yet in this discussion about education, it's all about humanizing the child. So that tension too, right? You discuss it in your book. So tell us a little bit more about how you approach this idea of the avant-garde and children's education, and what did you learn in that process?
So I think the dehumanization, that term that you brought through, I think that's a really interesting one, because I was coming to the humanizing idea again very gradually in the revising. It just kept appearing, and so many of the instances in which it appears in the book were actually very belated finds. And I realized, then you sort of think, oh, actually, this is what I've been seeing. It is here. And so this discussion of the dehumanization of art at the same time that you have a humanization of the child, which is not to imply that children were not seen as human per se, that there's, you can look at, beautiful images and depictions and discussions all through, but the kind of idea of what that process is and what that means, and what that's a very, that's something that's very much happening. So that an art critic, Manuela Abril, does a lot of synthesis of Ortega, and thinks about the idea of dehumanization as through the lens of childhood. And so when do we see the dawning of humanity in children? And do we see that in art? Do we see that in a moment, in a photograph? What is the moment of the capture, the way that they begin to smile or look at the world? And says in some ways that what we call the dehumanization of art, the successive abstraction, is actually a very human thing to do. It engages and tells, like you say, that it is not a blind reproduction of what was there, but is doing something new with it. So the avant-garde moment, can be read in so many ways. I think the ways in which it speaks to a larger impulse towards this whole, this view of society as somehow it's connected, and yeah, I think this this idea of humanizing is something that crosses from the more religious texts that I started to look at, as well as the avant-garde, but as I said earlier, is defined in very different ways. So you get the sense in pedagogues who are interested in or taking a Catholic view of the new education, that it's a kind of humanism, a true humanism, humanism in which the human is has a faith, is paired with God, and this is again the 19-teens, 20s, and then there's the humanism that is what I argue and what I see in this avant-garde is not necessarily a secular humanism, but is one which has an essence of spirit to it, and that is in some ways using the terms of we use mind, body, spirit, this holistic impulse, but which is doing something else with it, right? Is looking at that ineffable, that which cannot be captured in knowledge or books alone. And that gets also with the relationship between students and teachers, between poets and children, in the odes and discussions. So many poets, whether Lorca or Guillen, as I mentioned earlier, you can point to, or Carmen Conde as well, we spoke of, can point to the poems that are dedicated to the children around them, in name, in descriptions, and often sometimes are specific dedications, and other times, as in the case of Guillen, just has this corpus full of poems called Niño or Niñez, or the term occurs and recurs and recurs through Cántico. So there's something in this this conflation that I began to see in the writers of the time.
So I think that in that discussion, what it becomes evident is that the child, or the figure of the child, right, acquires many meanings and is placed in very different positions, right? And I was thinking about that relationship about production of unmediated or sort of sense of wonder, or thinking about the different structures, right, that goes on into this new relationship with art. But also at some point, for example, not being childish, like when you talk about Dali's Manifeste Groc, right? So you want to resist society's way of making into a child, right? So in that sort of subversive being told, you want to rescue some of that resistance, subversiveness, perhaps naivete, to actually engage and to preserve that sense of wonderment, but also of destruction as well, of what has been up to that point, right? So it feels like the figure of the child is used in so many different ways, that it really is sort of a brilliant counterpart, right, to talk about what that new art is trying to do. And in your book, and I don't know how you felt about this, one of the things that was, for me, surprising was that there was a very personal side of this interaction with children, right? That these poets that were writing poetry to each other's children, that they were dedicating poetry to their friends' kids, who happens to be the daughter of Pedro Salinas, or Juan Ramon Jimenez writing for other poets' children, or Lorca dedicating the poems to nieces and sisters and relatives. So very sort of the personal part of that production as well, right? So not so much about an abstract way of thinking about art, but also sort of that personal side in which, writing about them, communicating with them is also part of that artistic experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to describe it and to put it. I think as that was another processual aspect of writing this is that you start with a very abstracted, you're exactly doing the opposite of what you say your the impulse is of the work, thinking about the figure of the child, but what this childhood stands for, why are people talking about it, and then you realize, no, it is personal. These are individuals, these are human figures who have families and children themselves, and so being able to trace some of those movements gave it a richness and a depth that it wouldn't have otherwise. So I really enjoyed reading those encounters. In the case of Guillen as well, I found little poems, we call them florinatas, I think, that were published in sort of ephemeral newspapers, about just sort of little ideas of that had childhood. There were just a few lines, but if God could come down to earth and see it like a new child, what would he say? This sort of thought little images. And so those were 1922, 24. So it's around the same time that Cantico is being developed, and in which he's a young father. So when you put those pieces together, you see, oh, this is, somebody is you're watching a child sleep or play or open their eyes, and so it becomes a different kind of engagement, which all art is as well, in arguably. So it's not a radical or a surprising suggestion, but I think it nuances the academic tone and allows, for instance, with Unamuno, rather than just reading Amor y Pedagogía in a purely literary or intellectual phase, which is what I had done at the master's level, looking at it that way, actually realizing, oh no, seeing the ways that Unamuno was a master paper folder, origami, right, making little birds, which are part of which are what make up the various pre and after texts of the work, of these little origami birds and how they see the world, how would you educate a paper bird, which is not a human child, and then contrasting that with, for instance, his drawings from Unamuno's archives of his own children, which have a completely different aesthetic feel, right? These soft and flowing lines, the pencil and paper. So both of which are works of love, right, created by the hands, but which speak to kind of two different ways of looking at the text, and I think that bringing in the latter helped me to see it in a more multifaceted way, a more generous or sensitive way.
Yeah, and I think that you tend to forget that Unamuno had 9 children. So obviously he was obsessed about children as well, right? I mean, he had to think about
lost
what to
children
do.
as well.
Yes, exactly. And I have to say that your reading of Guillen's poems, really, it was revelatory for me. I think that I always approach it in such an intellectual way that when you read through this sort of that perspective from children and childhood and what it meant, it really I think opened up quite a lot of what those simple verses seem to contain. So thank you again. I mean, rediscovering Guillen that way was really gratifying among sort of the other parts that I was enjoying from your book. But let's get back to actually one of the main topics of your book, which is education, right? So the book is about education and it is about pedagogy, right? And I wanted to come back to sort of that word that you used about a holistic education, about the interest in humanhood, right? And also, I think that reading your book, we learn a lot about very important educators, right? That clearly made a difference. Perhaps their names are now either lost or this is not something that we are taught unless you're, clearly researching or learning about that topic. But can you explain a little bit more about what holistic education meant or what humanhood meant in that moment for educators? And would you like to highlight perhaps the work of one of them for our audience today?
Yeah, sure. So we've covered lots of shifting ground. So let me think what's, where to take that. I think I've spoken of humanism as this changing or shifting or contested term, but holism is one that we haven't spoken of so much. And it's not really a term that was coming into use in the 30s, but is not the term that I'm seeing earlier than that. But you get a lot of discussion of the global, total, of the whole, essentially. And part of that, as I said, is coming from the Gestalt. Part of it is this reaction against specialization or the over-technical view of the world. Because so much of pedagogical theory, in the 19th, very early 20th century, is very rigid and method-based. But so you continue to get methods. So there's the New Education Fellowship is the larger transnational movement. So that's the larger context, and that has to be stated. Nothing that's happening in Spain is completely separate from those larger efforts. So the research that is happening, the exchanges of going to Geneva, for instance, which is where Claparède and Piaget and others were, going to conferences of the New Education Fellowship across Europe. So young teachers being funded by the Publicaciones de Estudios to make these journeys and to study what's happening abroad in Germany, in Belgium, various methods that gain interest in France, the Freinet method, which comes into play, getting classrooms, schools as kind of producers of text and image. So they had their own printing presses, and classes would write and communicate with other classes. And actually, I bring that out here because it's one that I wish I'd focused more on. So one of the sort of 4 or 5 largest methods, and Tamar Groves and some others have done great work on that, and I've been discussing and reading that a little more about that in recent months, actually. So, but I focused more on open air schools. So that's one pedagogical method that I can bring forward. So some people might be familiar with the colonias escolares, the efforts to take children out of the cities in summers, take them to the seaside. But the idea of the open air school it's an extension of that, but it's a more general school method. So schools that would be built essentially almost as 3-walled classrooms. Sometimes that term is used. Gyms built onto the roofs of urban buildings. The idea that for health and so hygienic reasons, but also larger ideas of getting children to nature, of the health giving, but also the more spiritual extension of the self into the environment. So Rosa Sensat is a name that's maybe better known among those who've looked at pedagogy in Barcelona, who taught at a school on Montjuic and the Escuela de Bosque, and there's also the Escuela del Mar on the seaside in Barcelona, the Barceloneta. And I encountered some other teachers who had been trained at the colonias escolares, or like sanatoria on the northern coast, and then moved to start their own small homegrown efforts at open air schools. So one teacher named Margarita Aranda, and I don't, biographically, I don't have a lot on her. She's not a well-known figure at all, but had a little sort of mini Escuela del Bosque in the outskirts of Madrid, and this idea that the wind is blowing through the trees, and I think it was more of a summer effort. Children would come out on buses out to the Ciudad Lineal, which at that time was still a fairly new district, and had also been created with these organic, health-giving properties in mind. So the new pedagogy combined with new urban planning are all coming together, and it doesn't go as far, of course, for obvious reasons in Spain or Spanish history as it might have elsewhere. But those are the impulses and the initiatives that are springing up, all on the basis of international exchange and discussion and importation and adaptation.
Yeah, those I was very struck by that part of the internationalization, right? So there's a lot of these international global connections. I mean, even the significance of the Montessori schools in Barcelona, for example, that you discussed.
Sure.
But also, and I think that one of the topics that we were actually discussing among other Hispanics were the fact that there's so many teachers, women teachers, right, of the Republic were actually sent for training to the U.S. and they ended up in one of the, in a lot of the Seven Sister universities, as women's universities. They went to do, states and so on. So you actually see their names in catalogs and the books of the yearbooks, basically, of the colleges. For example, at Bryn Mawr College, I saw a few of them. And so there was a lot of sort of this communication and these connections, which I thought it was quite interesting. But also thinking about that use of the exterior as taking the students out to do things, because there's a lot of emphasis on sort of doing and learning by doing and paying attention. But I was struck by this discussion of engaging with environment, be that at the woods or the bosque or the bosque, and then by the sea, right? But it's a sense of mindfulness and spirit. Yet now we're at this moment in which we need students to go out and engage with the environment because of, the future. And it's a very material interest in our surroundings, because unless students pay attention to the world, how we're going to keep it, right? So I think we have turned again to sort of the outside, but it for very different purposes. What do you think that
No, it's a great question, and I think the as you say, the foundations are there, and I don't know if any work has really been done on thinking about the period that I studied at open air schools, for instance, as a foundation for this more environmental consciousness work. But yeah, absolutely. And the way that they go, collect leaves and press flowers, and there is an appreciation for understanding what's happening. And it's a form of science, of course, of natural education, and drawing maps of the neighborhoods, also this just spatial and geographical sense. But there's a really growing field in Hispanic studies as well, I think, of thinking about eco-pedagogy, like how to educate, how to even use Spanish studies to educate for environmental work. And I can take no credit for that. I've done very little. I'm just starting to read. I know Christine Martinez at NYU kindly shared some resources on that recently, because I was, have been interested in where this goes, and looking also in Latin America at some poets who take a very eco-critical view of the world, but also are in some ways reaching out to children or to a larger public with a pedagogical impulse and gaze. So I know there's going to be some work through, I believe, the Alces network in Spain this summer on eco-pedagogy for those who are interested. And I think it's, in all the talk and work on the Anthropocene, environmental degradation, it's a huge and growing topic, and one growing in importance as well. So yeah, I mean, perhaps there is a foundation in this way of thinking of looking about the world. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's coming often out of schools in Germany. In Charlottenburg was the first forest school, in a sense, and so those still exist. Those that strand of education is still, you can still enroll your child in kind of some aspect of a forest school model that goes back to this time. So
and perhaps
it's a really
fascinating
question.
As being very needed right now, right? It's almost an urgent matter. So I want to open the floor to our audience for questions, but before, as they get ready to ask questions, you can use the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So as you get ready, I will ask you one last question, Anna. So having read and written so much about education, and what it should achieve in children. So have you thought of your role as an educator, as a teacher? How has writing this book transformed you as an educator?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I have, on the one hand, it's at times made me feel hypocritical in a sense, right? You read about these incredibly thoughtful ways of, methods of create, and then as teachers today, right, in a university context, you're just trying to do the best that you can to reach your students and have them, remember. And so you think, oh, maybe there's so much more, right? There's always so much more. You feel there's always so much better that you can do. At the same time, I think that what I gained from reading some of these educators was this aspect of appreciation, of connection, and of not so much the hierarchical relationship as a relationship in which students learn from teachers and teachers learn from students, of a kind of meeting, an intellectual and spiritual somehow meeting. And that's something I was reading in Joachim Girard quite a lot of, and others. So I think that sense of the term love comes through, right? That this is a pedagogy that is something more than pedagogy. And so I hope that those relationships and that sense of appreciation for who the student is, meeting them and as a person with larger interests and contexts and engagements. I hope that that's something that I'm able to capture in my work with students.
All right, we have a question from Rebecca in Durham, and says, "Hi Anna, it's been lovely to learn about your work here in conversation with me. I wonder if you could discuss what you've learned about how childhood is bounded or boundaried in this period in terms of age, social class, gender, for example."
That's a great question. I think one thing that I had to think a lot about was particularly the gendered aspect, and that will be, I think, clear to anybody who looks at my text or the text that I'm reading. It's not a natural assumption that in writing about niños or el niño that is a general or universal child. In many cases, that is gendered male. And so in talking about energy and the dynamic energy of childhood, of making and unmaking and creating, oftentimes that does have a very male leaning or even intention. At the same time, I looked then for specific clues as to the coeducational impulse at that time. And so in a text, were the schools in fact meant to be coeducational, and in many cases they were. So that the Niño, and also in the images and the photographs of the classrooms. So I looked for that to try to deal with them. And so I translate sometimes differently in different ways, and I perhaps lean more towards children than is necessarily meant in the text. But I think in general it is a larger thing. In terms of age, I was really interested by this idea of primera infancia, segunda infancia, sort of the ways in which there are developmental ages and stages, and some interesting charts on development, and those are coming in for the first time in the early 20th century in different pedagogical or pedagogical contexts of when can a child first start to do this and do that, and the forerunners of developmental charts and expectations and measurements that are used today. Adolescence, I think, is also a key question, and Leslie Harkema has written beautifully on youth and adolescence in this period through Unamuno and others. So I speak a bit through some works of philosophy. The philosopher Joan Rora, who writes about adolescence as a period of instability and transformation. But I don't ever say my childhood in this book is X ages. I try to mark the ages of the children that are being referred to, and that was a conscious effort to further this humanizing act and impulse. But in general, I found it a very vague kind of childhood that I was reading. So it's important. It's really important question.
Oh, thank you. Aurelie, I saw your hand, and then I'll take Bob's question. Yeah.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for this presentation. Congratulations on the awards, I should say, because this book got several awards. I was curious to know if during your research, you encountered discussion about child labor, because at the very beginning of the 20th century, child labor was actually something happening in Spain, and a problem that was being discussed. So I'm just wondering if you were interested in that, and you encountered documents and what it is that these pedagogues were discussing regarding child labor.
Thank you for asking that. There's always these moments where you think of the things that you should have discussed and should have looked more into. It's not something that was coming through in the reform pedagogical text, because there's an assumption of not necessarily of a middle class child. There's also an interest in the rural, in serving and sort of underserved communities, and how to spread and widen education. But it's I guess where it does come through is in thinking about the urban setting that is the spur for the open air school movements, for instance, of health, so children's health. So there are very clear references in the earlier text that I'm looking at to simply the child mortality rate and the stresses and stressors of the family context and of the city. But what's interesting is that what I saw more of was, and partly because I'm really focused more on the 20s and 30s than the early years of the century, this may be one reason, but a movement that comes in from Germany called the Escuela del Trabajo is how it's translated, work or kind of labor as a educational impulse. And that sounds very grim, but it's children in field hands-on, right? So that by movement and action, but that's a educational movement, right? That's not a necessity. And so it's a really important question, I think, because in thinking about it's often in thinking about the ideas and the impulses and the ideals, it's very easy to lose sight of many of the underlying realities and the social realities. And so in part, I sort of try to gesture to them, but I know I don't, it's impossible to do them justice. So yeah, thank you for raising that.
Yeah, I was not only thinking of the industrial child labor, but also just agricultural. I mean, like the more agricultural parts of Spain where children would just not go to school. So how are they the object of these pedagogical programs? They're being left out, right? So it's again of the elite and the it's interesting. It's really interesting.
It is, and perhaps the also the comment on adolescent girls as workers in training does speak to another part of perhaps the more quantified impulse of pedagogy that I was implicitly through my avant-garde protagonists rejecting, which is the professional orientation as well. And that's again another strand, and it's different from the hands on the ground, but one which I think leads more into Francoist education and works. Tests, a lot of tests that are developed to see how, in a way, young people should be sorted and where they are headed and how they should be trained. And so that training versus education as well, that's what makes education a key term, because it's something that's not training. It's something that is idealized and that is probably never achieved.
Something really interesting to think about. Bob has asked, I'm going to ask Bob's question before I jump. I don't know if you want to answer. Let's go back to that question. So Bob says, did you come across any specific references to sensory education, taste, olfaction, etc., or the role of the senses in understanding childhood in more holistic, humanistic way?
Yeah, well, I think Rosi mentioned Montessori earlier, and Montessori is particularly well known for some of the sensorial elements, for instance, heat. So testing different, cups of water or something like that, or to understand gradations and that experience. Not drinking, yeah. Okay. Although that's another example, I guess, in psychology of how people learn, right? Is to the hot. You get burned once and you don't go back. So that does come up. But yeah, I think that the sensory, I don't have a chapter per se that I call about sensory, but I think about the mind as, psychology and how one views the world, and body as containing many of these sensorial aspects. So from movement and touch, have a haptic sense, which is something discussed quite a lot, actually, in
the gymnastics
grasping,
like that, right? With that even goes into drama at the time, right? I forget the name of that Swiss sort of kinetic philosopher who did
Lacroix, or
I forget. It even goes into like avant-garde stage production, like that. But, okay, cool, thank you.
But you do talk a lot about the visual sense. Sure. So I think that seeing seems a lot, take precedence over perhaps the olfactory or the tactile.
Yeah, but exactly. There are discussions about what takes precedence. So there's one beautiful essay that I encountered by Kathryn Kendrick, who I think it's from paper Coordinado de Papel. It's a short essay that pictures, or there's already a visual term that describes a boy's walk to school, and uses these really intensely sensorial terms to describe it as a kind of journey through the universe, almost, just to get into the school building, sort of hopping over the hot stones and feeling the scratches of the grasses, and he knows all of this like deeply in the body, and then goes into the school building where everything is then flattened and intellectualized. And so I don't know what the impulse of the writing is.
And listen, right? So all those other senses are tapped down. Yeah.
So let's take one last question before we wrap things up and let Anna rest. So following on our release question, Fran asked, in your answer, Anna, what was the class context for these models of progressive or modern education? And I think that also falls back to what Rebecca was asking. Reformers, I hope, wanted to spread these new methodologies through the national educational system, or did they restrict the scope of it to some classes? Were you? Yes.
So it's meant to be something that's happening nationally, and there are, as I mentioned, some movements that are specifically looking to empower rural school teachers. So, for instance, Freinet method and some others, which do so in many ways effectively, but always within a limited context as far as the training and resources can go. And there's an expansion of schools, but it's never sufficient. But much of this, you correctly note, is at an elite level. And again, it's not, part of that is where it's happening. But so if we talk about Madrid and Instituto Libre de Enseñanza, and the Instituto Escuela, that is going to be a more elite aspect. At the same time, in the city of Madrid, there are reform models that are being pioneered at schools like the Escuela Cervantes, which are a series of model schools that do have a wider range and network of that look to take a broader view. And Montessori's work itself comes from an effort to engage children who otherwise do not have those resources, and it gets kind of co-opted in an elite sense. But in being brought in, she was invited to live and work in Catalonia by the government in the 19-teens, and stays for quite some time on and off. I mean, I think that those schools, the work of Rosa Sensat, who has a very similar as Montessori, is pointedly looking to do work of social justice, and Sensat writes quite a lot about this. But in effect, what it is, it becomes limited and elite. So there are growing circles and efforts and different networks, I think, that are at play on the grassroots and on the rural level, as in the model pedagogical schools. And as Rosie said at the beginning, I think also these nameless teachers, right? The reading sort of gazettes of educational work, who's awarded what grants to go abroad and who's graduated from various escuelas normales. You see sort of the extent to which this is a widened effort and what it's looking to do, but of course has, again, a rather limited impact perhaps in the wider, what another journalist called the Escuelas de España, so traveling through and seeing the very uneven application and resources that was at heart what they were looking to change.
Yeah, education is always a work in progress, right? Or it should be anyway. So thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending an hour of your summer time with us. Today is the beginning of summer solstice. Congratulations again, Anna. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Have a great summer. We'll see you back in the fall. We have 3 more books scheduled for our season before we say goodbye. So thank you, and have a great summer.